Welcome back to the Mina Kimes Show, featuring Lenny, the only NFL podcast. One of the hosts is always competing for playtime. That's Lenny. I'm Mina Kimes. And I am joined for the first time in quite some time. It's been at least a year since I've had Sam Monson, now of the Check the Mic podcast. Same co-host for many years, different name, different home. Sam, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Look at you all prospering since we've last been on the show together.
You as well. Check the Mic is a great name, by the way, as I said to you right before we started taping. I like that a lot. We love a good football double entendre. Double entendre, right? Yeah. Okay, so we are careening towards the NFL draft, and in the coming weeks, I'm going to be doing breakdowns of the top players in the draft. I'm going to bring back the War Room concept that we did last year, which was a ton of fun. But every year before I get to the draft and after we come out of free agency, although it's not quite over, there is still a quarterback who is hanging out, a couple quarterbacks yet to be signed. I like to go through every team in the NFL and identify what outstanding needs they have ahead of the draft. And, obviously teams don't exclusively draft for need. It's not a good way to draft, but it does play a big role in the NFL draft. And I think, and just kind of evaluating where teams might go with that. So we're going to, like I said, the reason I'm just like, let's get going. We're going to do every team. This can take some time if I'm not managing the clock well. We're going to just alternate. I'm going to give you my remaining needs for a team. Tell me what you think, if you've got the same ones. I'm guessing you guys do a similar exercise too, right? With team needs.
Yeah, pretty much. And I got to say, it's kind of brave for you to invite somebody from our show on to any podcast featuring 32 teams, because anytime that appears in our title, it's like hours later by the time we're even remotely finished.
The one time, I feel like once I did tell you guys, I thought you should start quicker, and you actually do start quicker since we had that conversation. Okay, so we're gonna get right to it. I thought we should start with the AFC West. I feel like people always start in the East and move west. I like to
West Coast bias.
West Coast over here. I'll go first. Let's start with the LA Chargers. I don't think it's ever been done on an NFL podcast, so we're going to make history here. The LA Chargers had a interesting, not particularly loud free agency, right? You brought back Khalil Mack, you let Joey Bosa walk, you signed Najee Harris to a reasonable deal, Bradley Bozeman at center, Deshaun Hand, Denzel Perryman, and there's some players that have left, corners, and that's one of the needs. So the needs that I have on my kind of tier one needs for the Chargers: wide receiver, glaring, neon lights, fireworks going off, wide receiver, corner now with also Asante Samuel Jr. I think he's still a free agent yet to be signed, which is kind of interesting. So he might come back. I would still say corner, and still and they probably heard me. Mekhi Becton, they did sign, which somewhat downgraded the need for interior offensive line. I still have that as a need. And then tight end. Those are I have at the top, second level, edge, running back, defensive tackle. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the only one I would add on top of that is I think the interior of that defensive line as well, I think needs some remedial work, but I think there's a lot of teams that that's true for. They're an easy team though, where like they have the glaring need, right? Like the thing that we always try and get yourself. Free agency is all about ticking the glaring needs, so you don't go into the draft needing to like grab that one position that fixes it. The Chargers have that though still with wide receiver / tight end. I don't think it necessarily matters which one of those they fill early in the draft, but if they don't come out of the draft with one of those two positions filled quickly, I think they've got problems.
I think at pick 22, it's a really interesting spot to be picking between one of those two positions if they go, although it's, Jim Harbaugh, so watch them take Omarion Hampton there or whatever, which is another thing, by the way, a lot of people think could potentially happen. I think for me, it really has to do with the players available. If one of Ted McMillan, Matthew Golden, Colston Loveland, Tyler Warren are there at 22, I would be upset as a Chargers fan if they took a running back. You know what I mean? Like it kind of has to do with the way the board shakes out, because I think one of those four players will likely be there. I suspect, maybe not, but if those four players are gone, then you feel a little bit like, okay, maybe you don't have to take a wide receiver or a tight end. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, and I think the Omarion Hampton thing got less likely with the signing of Najee Harris. Not that Harris is necessarily going to be, a superstar running back, but like they didn't invest in running back last year. They brought in like all of the Ravens castoffs. So I don't think that they're necessarily going to target this first round running back just because they want to run the ball. I think they know they can run the ball without necessarily like a crazy investment in that position. But I think, yeah, one of those 4 guys will probably be there at that spot, and I think one of those 4 guys should be the pick.
What do you have for the Denver Broncos?
For the man, that roster's good all of a sudden. I
Yeah,
would Denver's one of
this
those
was
teams.
I so I only have 2 needs. As my top tier needs. Sorry to interrupt you, but I had the exact same reaction. I was like, "Damn, okay." Alright, sorry, keep going.
Yeah, like there's some teams where you go through and I'm doing these notes and I'm like, man, there's a lot of needs. And it's putting down lots of different positions. There are other teams where when you get to like the second or the third need, I'm writing question marks at the end of them. Like, I mean,
Yeah,
is it a need? Kind of. So like Denver could use another wide receiver. Cortland Sutton is either a high end 2 or a low end 1. So depending on, how you view him, how you draw that line anyway. They need the other one, right? Whichever one you view him as, you need the other version. They could use a running back, but I don't think it's necessarily like a desperation need. And then you're into like, does Evan Ingram keep you away from drafting a tight end, right? Like if you love
yeah.
Colson Loveland or Tyler Warren and they're available in your spot, would you still draft one given that you brought in Evan Ingram? So, but like it's a couple of little skill position players.
Yeah, what I love about the Broncos and the position that they're in is they can now draft from really a not a place of desperation.
Yeah.
Because so I did my needs before free agency just for my own usage, not for the pod. And then I go back after free agency and they addressed so many of their needs like linebacker, tight end, as you said, it's not prohibitive from them improving or adding or getting younger and cheaper at those needs, but it gives them a lot more optionality because they were one of my free agency winners. I absolutely loved their signings, some of the players that they added on both sides of the ball, frankly. And I share, yeah, it's just running back, receiver is what I had as the 2 main needs, but not, out of total desperation. Running back, they're going to draft a running back. I think the question is when. They would be a
Yeah.
potential Hampton team for sure, but they could also wait because this is I'm going to talk about an exceptional running back class. Yeah, I was the Bronco. There's probably like 2 or 3 teams where I was like, whoa, this is actually a really good roster, and I felt very acutely like that. That's like when I did this for them, I was like, oh my god, like I didn't think, I don't know why, but I didn't notice how good and how deep they were at multiple positions, and they're a really good football team. So,
Yeah, I mean, I kind of thought that before free agency, and then, like you said, they had a really good free agency. So all of a sudden, you're looking at this roster like there's not much wrong with it.
so I'll do the Chiefs next. You know what? Actually, I'll do the Raiders. Yeah, okay. I'll do the Raiders. You do the Chiefs. The Raiders, okay, so just to kind of they didn't have like a huge free agency, but they added obviously Geno Smith, brought back Malcolm Kuntz, Jeremy Chin, Raheem Mostert. Wait, Mostert, yeah.
Yeah,
Alex Kappa. It's a lot of guys. Nothing that I think would really prevent you from adding at those positions, to be honest. It caused me to move like safety down a little bit, but there's still some pretty significant needs. I wrote down as my priorities on offense, running back, and a receiver. Defense, corner is a pretty glaring need. I wrote linebacker. Robert Spillane left a free agency. They bring in Atlanta Roberts. Secondary needs, I wrote guard and safety. But I think running back, wide receiver, and corner are the ones, Sam, that really jumped out to me.
yeah. I think running back and receiver are definitely my kind of secondary needs for them. I think Brock Bowers kind of gives you a lot of leeway at receiver. You don't necessarily need that elite number one guy because Brock Bowers can be your number one in a way. When the 49ers had just George Kittle, and obviously they put a ton of stuff around him, but for a while Kittle was the number one receiver there. And I think teams can do that if you have a guy as special as Brock Bowers can be. But I think, yeah, an extra running back, an extra receiver. And then I wrote basically the whole defense. Like they've got good players in various spots, but there's no level of that defense where you couldn't add somebody
Yeah.
and have him plugged in immediately as a starter and be like a significant upgrade. Even, I mean, Max Crosby is obviously a superstar. Christian Wilkins, they paid big money to, and he's a really good player. But even there, you could add a defensive tackle. He could walk in and start. You could add another edge rusher who could start over Malcolm Kuntz. Maybe Tyree Wilson would stop you doing that if you think his career arc is going to continue moving in the right direction. But I think, every level of that defense, I think you could add a starter to.
I'm very interested if they draft a corner in the first 3 rounds, what kind of corners Pete Carroll is drawn to, because he is one of the best, secondary coaches in the history of this league, and I think we associate him with the Richard Sherman prototypical size, but he has drafted and developed many different types of corners over the years. He was obviously still with the team when they drafted Devin Witherspoon, who's very
Yeah.
different, obviously. So I think that would be really interesting. I want to posit something for you on offense. Ask you a question before we move on. So a very common mock pick we're seeing now is Ashton Genty to the Raiders at pick 6. Pete Carroll loves the run game. They need a back. He's obviously the best draft back in the class. But would you rather have Ashton Genty with pick 6 and then whatever they're doing in the second round because they traded the third for Geno, or like a Tet McMillan and one of the Ohio State backs? Because their offensive coordinator, Chip Kelly, is from Ohio State, but I haven't seen people make that connection very often. And I say one of because I think they're both awesome in terms of Judkins and Henderson. What would you do?
So normally I'm on the side of like, don't draft running backs too highly, come back for the value, get them lowered down. I'm starting, the longer we do all this stuff though, across the board, the more I'm starting to think that you can make not exceptions, because I think when you start chasing
Yeah,
exceptions, you get into trouble. But I think there's a different rule set for guys that are genuinely special. Those like that blue chip term exists, I think, for a reason, because those guys should be categorized slightly differently to the guys that aren't blue chip but are still very good. And I think Genty, you can make the argument that he's, the most special running back prospect to come along since Adrian Peterson. Like whether you put him above or below Bijan Robinson, Saquon Barkley, like he's in that conversation, right? McMillan isn't. I mean, McMillan is a level down from even last year's top 3 wide
yeah,
receivers. Like he's of the next group down. So I'm going to take the guy that I think is special, even if it's at a less valuable position. I think
yeah.
the Raiders have the environment that he can come in and make an impact. Like you're not drafting him to fix the running game. The running game should already work. You're drafting him to make it like function the way it should, and really do what he can do. And then I actually love the value of the second and third round receivers in this draft. I don't like it at the top of the first, but I love it in the second and the third round. So that's where I would try and play that rather than the other way around.
I'm in agreement with you generally and certainly about Genty. However, if it was a situation where a team, let's say picking right before the Cowboys, for example, wanted to trade up to 6 and you could trade down, get McMillan in the Ohio State back and draft capital in the process, that might be a
Yeah,
little
then I'm
bit
trading down. I'm
trickier
always taking the trade downs.
because this team has a lot of needs on defense, as we discussed. All right, the Chiefs, you go. A lot of needs, I thought.
Well, the Chiefs, yeah, they had an interesting free agency, right? Because they sort of solved left tackle, I guess, with Jalen Moore, but they solved it in a way that I don't think anybody saw coming. This guy with a low sample size of play coming from the 49ers, but pretty good play, gave him pretty significant money. So you kind of have to say that's left tackle, at least out of the acute needs bucket. It's probably still something, maybe they should build in a contingency for. I think guard is still a problem. I don't think you can necessarily just rely on Kingsley Suamataia starting year 2 at an unfamiliar position and hitting the ground running and not being a problem. I would want them to at least bring in some contingency there. Um, I think defensive line depth, that's where they lost a lot of that in free agency.
Yeah.
With guys like Tershawn Wharton departing, they need to kind of restock that defensive line depth, because that's been quietly like a real strength of this team in the last couple of years. And then I, I think they need either the Travis Kelsey succession plan, or
Yeah.
they need that number one weapon from somewhere, right? Like this receiving core is still very much in flux between wide receiver and tight end. I think they just need one guy to anchor that group and make it sort of like, here's the tent pole of this whole thing exists around.
I agree on all fronts. Yeah, I have tight end as a secondary need, pardon me. I would also throw in running back. I'd like them to draft a back. Uh that Davis is another secondary need, but,
Yeah.
the run game really they just got so little out of it last year, and it wasn't entirely because of the backs, although a lot of it was, frankly. I think just adding some speed and youth at the position. Receivers remains a secondary need, continue throwing darts at that, I think, but yeah. The offensive line question is so interesting with the Chiefs because so much of it depends on their internal evaluations. Like when they signed Jalen Moore, everyone was kind of like, "What? Okay." But so clearly they saw something and they believe in
Yeah.
him and they believe in Sua Mataya as a guard. Otherwise, they wouldn't have made all of the moves with Tooney and whatnot. So I'll be curious to see. I think what they do in the draft will tell us a little bit about how they view those players in the building as well. And it might be different from how we regard them. All right, the NFC West. I'll start with the Seahawks. My account. I just wrote guard in all caps 6 times. It's unbelievable. Tight end, receiver as primary needs. Secondary, corner, safety, linebacker. They completely rehauled their offense. I've talked about it a lot. You also on defense you re-signed Ernest Jones, Jaron Reed, who was sneaky good last year. This is to me about the offense because the defense is actually in pretty good shape. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I wrote down interior offensive line 3 times, which is kind of the same place they were a year ago. They're a weird team because they don't like spending those first round draft picks on interior offensive linemen. And coming out of the draft, I was sort of like, okay, fair enough. Like I was like, this is John Schneider vindicated because they didn't draft Jackson Powers Johnson in the first round. You know, they came back later in the draft. They got a guy we really liked, and it didn't work out yet. Now maybe it will. Maybe those guys, just take a little bit longer. On the other hand, you look at it and say, well, Jackson Powers Johnson was pretty good right out of the gate, and you know Christian Haynes wasn't. That's probably why they're drafted that far apart. And maybe sometimes, even if it's not what you believe to be like optimal draft strategy, like at some point the need and the fit matches up and just draft the player.
They also they're in on all of these free agents and they don't sign them, right? Like and there's always a reason, like, oh, they want to do a physical for Will Fries and he didn't do a physical. The Vikings didn't demand one. Okay, fine. Or oh, they didn't want to give enough guaranteed money to ex center prospect Tevin Jenkins. I don't know. They're being associated. It's not like they're very aware of the need.
Yeah.
But I've talked about this. If they can't improve, they're asking a lot of scheme to help their offensive line. And I keep hearing that, oh, the scheme's gonna help them. It's a Kubiak scheme. How'd that work out in New Orleans? Y'all, like I have very little faith that scheme can do all this work instead of talent. So yeah, like Tyler Booker, Greg Zabel, whatever, the interior offense. And I actually think that where they're picking, it'll probably work out in their favor
Yeah.
because ahead of them, I'm not seeing interior offensive line as much of a need. So I do think they'll have that option. Watch them take Emin though, and just say F it. That would be so Seahawks to do that.
That's the thing. Like, I think it will match up in terms of having a
Yeah.
really good offensive lineman available for them at that spot, and I wouldn't be more confident than a coin flip that they'll actually take it if that happens.
What do you got for the Niners?
They're gone like the opposite way of Denver. All of a sudden, you look at the Niners and
Yeah.
you're like, "Man, there's a lot of needs pretty quickly." I think the offensive line has been a declining problem for a while, a declining force and a bigger problem, over the last couple of years. They need a left guard. They need arguably a center. They need they need some kind of tackle contingency because Trent Williams, I think, has now entered the phase of his career, like the Tyron Smith area, the Teron Armstead area, where you basically have to budget in 25% of the games he's not going to be there at this stage. Like when he's there, he's still arguably the best left tackle in the game. But now you basically have to factor in there's probably 4 games a year he's not playing in. So I think they need at least 2 or 3 offensive linemen. The defensive line outside of Nick Bosa is awful now. They just don't. They've lost
Yeah.
all the talent that they had, and it was already a problem spot. And then I think a couple of like secondary is like cornerback 2, safety 2, couple of spots in the secondary they could add, but like the trenches, both sides.
Trenches. Yeah, I wrote trenches. The defense really struck me how many needs there were on defense on this team, and they've lost guys. Jarius Ward is gone, Hufanga is gone, Drake Greenlaw is gone.
Yeah.
Javon Hargrave obviously didn't play last year, but he's gone. Kinlaw's gone. Like there's just they're really the cupboard needs to be refilled on defense in a big way. And I would put an emphasis on the defensive line, although corner is one that it's interesting where they're picking. You go in a few different directions. Offensive line certainly is also a need, as you said. And like if, Membu is there, am I saying this right now? Armand Membu, they'll probably run that one in. But the defensive line absolutely has to be addressed for this team. I'll go Rams. Significantly less needs in my estimation.
Yeah.
Because they've drafted so well, frankly, but also because they, I think they addressed some of their needs in free agency, particularly Devontae Adams, which was one of the signings that I really loved. Puna Ford is, Mina Kimes Show favorite for years, helping shore up, giving some heft to that defensive line. I wrote linebacker, which is interesting because I don't think we've said that yet, or at least it's not been an emphasis for any of these other teams. And then I wrote corner as another one. I just saw I feel like Akila Witherspoon is just going to sign 1-year deals with them forever. But I think corner is another area they could go in. Offensive tackle, I think Havenstein's getting up in the years a little bit. They signed Alaric Jackson, but it might be near the end of the road for him. And then I wrote tight end. McVay's been kind of dabbling in 12 personnel over the years. I think that's a position that they would like to add up, but those are secondary needs. I really, the only things I thought I'd really like to see them attack this is linebacker and corner, which is a pretty good spot to be in.
Those are the two needs I had. So I had cornerback, and then I wrote down linebacker lull because they're not like they need it, but they're not like it's intentional. They don't want to invest in the linebacker spot, and that's fine. That's just the way the Rams do business,
Because
apparently.
they're in the NFC, right? And I feel like with the Eagles, the Lions, Packers, you need linebackers, right? Like they have really devalued this position.
Yeah.
I thought they would sign a free agent, they're so
Maybe
cheap.
it's like a 4D chess thing where that meme of Kyle Shanahan putting the bullseye around a linebacker. Well, the way of solving that is to just not have any linebackers that are any good. Like if you invested in a linebacker, Shanahan would go after that guy and make him look ridiculous. But if we already know they're not great to begin with, who's he going to target?
Interesting. I like that idea. Even their line, but yeah, I mean, let me throw out one more. Quarterback?
Definitely, but this is why. So the Rams were another one of those teams, a little bit like Denver. When you start looking at it, you're like, man, this roster's good. Like they can,
Yeah.
and they gave the Eagles the best game in the postseason of anybody, right? However close they got to it, it was closer than anybody else was, including the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. So you can construct a pretty good argument that the Rams could have won a Super Bowl a year ago and are therefore pretty close to it next year because there hasn't been that much turnover. They have arguably gotten better so far. That's why it never made any sense whatsoever to be like, yeah, of course we'll trade away Matthew Stafford and like voluntarily enter quarterback purgatory. They were going to give him another go around, but at some point, yeah, they do need the succession plan.
All right, Cardinals. I'm interested in seeing if your needs align with mine because they're very thematic.
So similar to the Raiders, I think they need kind of just impact defensive players generally at all three levels. So they've done a pretty good job actually of adding the defensive line, like Josh Sweat coming over. Baron Browning, I still have some faith in will be better this year than last year because I think he was battling injury last year. Dalvin Tomlinson, I think, makes a difference. Like we described that defensive front as being like, week 4 of a preseason when you read out the names. It's like all these guys belong in the NFL, just not on the first team. They belong on the second team that only starts, when the first team is having a break for the preseason, but that was like their starting unit. Now, all of a sudden, you're adding like the first team names to that group. But I still think you can add like an impact player up front. You can definitely add impact players at the linebacker and the defensive back level. You got Buda Baker, Garrett Williams, I think are good players, but outside of that, like they need an influx of talent.
Yeah, I just wrote defense, all 3 levels. Take the
Yeah.
best dudes. That was, I guess they could add a receiver later in the draft, maybe a guard, no doubt. But even with the additions they made in free agency, they just got to improve that. It was defense, by the way, quietly did improve last year.
Yeah.
Credit to their defensive coordinator Nick Rallis. Even with the no name defense, I thought they played way above their name recognition level by the end of the season, and they certainly have added some name recognition with Sweat, but that's something that they got to keep adding. Okay, AFC East. Let's rocket to the other side of the country. I'll go first with the Pats. I actually curious to hear your thoughts on this because Ben Solak and I talked about. I think they're one of the most interesting teams in the draft because of where they're drafting and their needs and whether or not draft and player aligns with those needs. So similar to the Chargers, glaring need at receiver and offensive line. I wrote offensive tackle as the glaring need, not guard, so that's
Right.
different from the Chargers. But edge is also a very obvious need. So the top three needs I wrote offensive tackle, receiver, edge. Below that, I put guard, tight end as kind of secondary things. Do you view those three positions as the biggest needs, and do you think that'll impact their draft strategy at the top?
Yeah, well, so I didn't even go beyond the first two. I'm like, they have such glaring needs still at wide receiver and offensive line that I'm like, anything else would be, a secondary, tertiary concern for me. Like, we've spent a ton of money in free agency and we didn't address really the two biggest glaring weaknesses that were and for them it's like more important because they have Drake May. They've got a quarterback who looks good despite the terrible situation around him. Like, the first thing they should be doing is let's go fix that as soon as humanly possible. And to be fair, to their credit, they have tried, right? They were in on Chris Godwin apparently, and he, went back to the Bucks. So it's not like they just went, we're good, we can leave it. But they didn't get anything over the line. So they're now in this position where they pick number 4 overall. And I don't like the value of any of the players that would fill those positions for them at number 4 overall. I don't think Tet McMillan is worth that draft spot. Now, actually, the one caveat to that would be if you think Travis Hunter plays wide receiver for you, I think Travis Hunter is worth the 4th overall pick.
I know. So interesting. That is such an interesting curveball. Which Ben and I talked about this. Like I've been a Travis Hunter corner, but you can't now play a receiver if he's with the New England Patriots. And it is like because I got some pushback from Pats fans about not focusing on edge. So edge is a glaring need. Abdul Carter would be a fantastic draft pick for them,
Right.
but I would contend that the development of your quarterback is the most important thing
Yeah.
this season. And so I, I I love the position they're in, but I also hate it because I wish it wasn't I wish they weren't operating from so much desperation with regards to helping the quarterback at this point going into the draft. And
Well,
it
it's the
makes
classic, like, it's the thing. It's why drafting for need is a bad strategy generally, right? Like, normally you don't want to be in a position where you have to go after like the biggest weakness on your roster because this is the situation you can end up with, which is if let's say Travis Hunter's gone or we don't think he's a wide receiver, like whatever, he's out of the discussion. Well, now you're like, none of the players that fit this need in a vacuum are worth the 4th overall draft pick, right? Instead, we need to turn down an Abdul Carter or a Mason Graham or whoever because we have to draft Will Campbell or Membu
uh,
or Tet McMillan. And we might be overdrafting any one of those guys by 10, 15 draft spots.
that's another similar to what I was talking about at the top with the Chargers. Pardon me, not the Chargers. Who was I talking about trading down? But they're another one where it's like I think you have to entertain a trade down if you can still get one of those tackles and pick up draft capital and then throw a bunch of resources at receiver. But
Yeah.
then, Pac fans are like, why would you pass on a generational player? Unless they really feel good about Hunter as a receiver, which I feel good about Hunter as a receiver too. That's the craziest part about all of this. Okay, that's a whole, like I said, it's fascinating. What do you got for the Bills?
Uh Cornerback 2. I think Christian Benford is a really good starter. I
Yeah.
think they need another really good starter, even with additions that they've made. I, look, I think defensive tackle is a need for them in terms of just another
Suspended.
body, like
Like
another
all the guys they
factor.
signed can't play.
I like what they have, but I think they need more heft in there. And then I'm gonna die on this hill that they still need an X wide receiver. They seem intent to prove that they don't. I feel like it's a missing skill set in that receiving core. Whether or not I don't think they need a number 1, quote unquote, like he doesn't need to be, this elite number 1 X receiver, but I think they need somebody that can play outside one-on-one in the boundary because they don't have one.
Yeah, I wrote receiver and corner too at the top, and safety is the other one. You know, he brought back Damar Hamlin, but I think that's a position that they could still upgrade at. You saw that last year. Um, yeah, the receiver thing is interesting because the Palmer signing was an odd one to me, Josh Palmer, because it's
Yeah.
like, okay, cool, another good guy, like who's like solid chain mover. He's super when I think about Josh Palmer, the first word that comes to mind is solid, right? He's
Yeah.
just super solid. He's a great wide receiver 3, maybe a wide receiver 2. But like yeah, it just still feels like they need like a difference maker. And maybe some of this will have to do with I think what they think they have in Keon Coleman in year 2, but I do wish they had some more speed there as well. Jets, I'll go for the Jets. I wrote right tackle, tight end, safety, receiver as my primary needs. Um, they did sign at safety Andre Cisco. I still believe that's a need. Uh, yep, those are my I have some secondary ones, but those are my main ones. What do you think?
Where's are we're done with quarterback with Justin Fields
Oh
look,
gosh,
I
because
know
I
you and
just
I
don't think they're gonna do it in this draft. Do you?
I don't think Fields takes you out of the quarterback market. Now, it stops you going crazy. It stops you needing, right? It stops you going crazy with we got to trade up, we got to do
Yeah,
something nuts. But like if Shador falls to the Jets, are they passing on him?
I don't know. What would you do?
I wouldn't. I mean, I would take him if I'm the Jets and he falls to that spot.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. Quarterback. I don't know. I think I've just got it in my head that they're not drafting. I should have added it as a secondary need at minimum because it makes sense to take a stab at one later in the draft, no doubt. Yeah, I think I've just got it in my head that they're not going to take a quarterback in the first round. That neither of those two guys will be there for them. But yeah, that is. How do you? Let's. Okay, if Shador, let's say he does fall to them. How do you feel about the situation that he's walking into?
Well, that's the yeah. I don't love it for him.
Yeah. It's, they seem to be just with their signings and the way they're talking, so acutely aware of the fact that they're not quite a rebuilding team, but like a assessing the damage of the last couple of years. It's like they're like looking at the wreckage site and trying to like see what's salvageable. And there's still good players on this roster.
Yeah.
I don't know. It seems like a tough situation to drop a quarterback into, but you're right. It is true that they might take one, and certainly if Shador's there, it's a conversation. The Miami Dolphins, interesting free agency. What do you have for them?
Basically the whole offensive line still. Like there was this weird dynamic last year where all of the Shanahan schemes, which for years had done this amazing job of like they'd had rough looking offensive lines on paper for a while and it never seemed to matter. Like Shanahan's scheme just nullified the weakness on the offensive line. And then last year that came crashing to a halt for all of them. 49ers line fell apart. The Dolphins line was a disaster. The Texans line was a disaster. And Miami's, I think, had been the worst on paper of those three for a while. I think now it's still a weakness. Like James Daniels coming over is a nice addition, but left guard with Liam Eichenberg is still a problem. I think tackle is still a problem. Number one, Austin Jackson at right tackles, I don't think very good. I think they could upgrade him immediately. Left tackle, Teron Armstead is that bucket, right? You have to factor in he's probably going to be missing, a third of the season. And
Right.
even then, he's not a long-term solution. So like you need a left tackle. And maybe Patrick Paul is that guy. They drafted him for the future, but can you rely on that or do you need to get aggressive? Like for them, I keep pairing them in the draft with those guys that are like left tackle in name, but everyone's calling them a guard, right? If Will Campbell fell to them, I feel like it would be a perfect fit. If Kelvin Banks is there, I feel like that's a good fit as well. He can be your left guard right now. And if Armstead goes down, they can kick out and maybe they play 3 games at left tackle. Like those, I think, are dream scenarios for Miami.
Yeah, I wrote offensive tackle as the first need by like a pretty significant margin. I think that they, yeah, right. Um, they need to work on the secondary was the other thing that came to mind. You lose Javon Holland. There's a few players actually that they've lost. I mean, over the years, I think just cornerback has quietly become a need,
Yeah.
cornerback and safety. So I just wrote secondary. I would love to see them add like an every down back later in the draft. They've just got these, they've got Achan and Jan. I mean, but it's like, do you really want to spend more draft capital on the running back position? But they got to get
It would
serious at running the football.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see, just a different style back because all of these sort
Yeah.
of fast straight line guys that none of them you want to necessarily give the workload to. Like, what if we just put a bruiser back there? Um, and then I think defensive tackle because, Calais Campbell theoretically isn't
Still
there
great, but
anymore.
yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. NFC East. I'll start with the Giants. Um, so this is another one similar to the Broncos where it wasn't the whole team I thought was good, but I actually think the defense is in pretty damn good shape, which that took me by surprise a little bit, but that has to do with some of the moves they made in free agency, bringing in Javon Holland and Paulson Adebo, who are two players that I like. I already think that front has some obviously very good players. So my emphasis is really all on offense. I wrote quarterback, offensive tackle, wide receiver, um, as my main three needs. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely quarterback, definitely offensive line. I think you can add the kind of again the secondary pieces in the defense. Like you could add another cornerback, you could add another defensive lineman, but those are I think definitely secondary concerns. Obviously, quarterback is the biggest one. Like Jameis is not, the
Yeah.
future. Like Jameis is a stopgap or just to make sure that Cutlets isn't the top name on the depth chart at any point. You need the quarterback at some point, whether that's Aaron Rodgers, whether that's Shador Sanders. And then that offensive line, it's still kind of a mess. Like they're moving in the right direction, slowly, incrementally. Greg Van Roten's a nice signing, but you know, the problem I think that they have with that offensive line in part is that some of the moves they've made to make it better were
Yeah.
unlikely to ever do that. Like signing John Runyon was never likely to be a significant upgrade. And now do you bail on that after a year because it hasn't been an upgrade? Or you're like, no,
Yeah.
we paid this guy last year. He's gotta be the answer.
Yeah, that's the thing about the Boston. They have invested a lot, both in terms of draft capital and money at the position. And Andrew Thomas obviously was a great draft pick, but outside of him, I think there's just question marks about every position. I just wrote
Yeah.
tackle the off. I think it's time to cut bait and right tackle to me. If you can just get another bookend tackle, that would be fantastic. I wrote receiver as a second name just because they do have obviously they brought back like Neighbors who's a superstar and you brought back Darius Slayton. I think like a little later in the draft, I wouldn't mind if they added another receiver. All right, Eagles. This is you.
Eagles. That was the hardest one to come up with anything. I looked at this roster, I'm like, I what? There aren't needs here. Right guard, basically, because the right guard is departed in Makai Becton from last year. Outside of that, it's like depth. I'm right guard's the only starting spot I can really find to put a new player into. Outside of that, they're just looking for like filling the bottom 25 spots on the roster.
I wrote defensive depth at all three levels. That's it, and that's
Yeah.
probably what they're gonna do. And, Sweat, Williams, Walk, you have guys there. You have, like, um, Jomo showed some
Yeah.
stuff, last year. Priceoff is still in the building. Obviously, Nolan Smith was great last year. I think you just wanna keep doing what they always do, which is throwing resources on that defensive line and the offensive line, to your point. And then corner, I think, is the other thing. I think, just again, continuously adding depth there. But this is not and defensive tackle. This is not desperation. This is just continuing to add there. Commanders, on the other hand, do very much need one position. And I just wrote edge in all caps. There's other things you could, like another tight end, a corner. I wrote guard, whatever, another receiver. But the edge, edge. I am befuddled that they did not do more to address edge in free agency. How about you?
Yeah, same. By far their biggest need. Like clearly the most acute need on this team. They've done nice things, right? They've made some big moves in the offseason. They made some splash plays, but that's still by far. I mean, they traded away, their two best edge rushers a couple years ago, and they've never done much to replace them. And that remains the biggest need since that point.
It'll be interesting to see because of the trades that they've made, they're not like flush. They
Right.
they had so much money. I don't know. Yeah, because I was like, "Ooh, is this a team that could go up and maybe get one of?" It's an interesting edge draft, though, and we don't have to get into it here. Where after Carter, it's like everybody's all over the board on all of the edge rushers. So it's not like I'm like, "Oh, they're so obviously they got to trade up, they got to get Mike Green, or they got to go get Jalen Walker." It's a little bit tricky. I'll be interested in seeing how they maneuver, but it is something that they very much have to address. Finally, before we take a break, you have the Dallas Cowboys.
Um, this is a team that needs quite a lot.
Yeah,
This whole,
I was
we don't
surprised
use
by
free agency to yeah, to fill needs. Like maybe you should, because I think they definitely need a wide receiver too. Somebody that isn't CeeDee Lamb that can make an impact on that offense. I think outside of obviously they brought back a Diggy Zua before free agency hit. They've got Micah Parsons there. They still need to pay. Outside of those two, the defensive line still needs work. And then running back, the collection of like old running backs that were once great didn't work for them last year. I don't think the Javonte Williams thing is going to transform that unit either. So, like, they need an actual young running back that can make an impact right now.
I don't obviously, they weren't, like, prolific in free agency, likely with an eye towards, they're gonna pay Mike Parsons and as they should, but I don't understand, like, the players they did pick, right? Um, like Javonte Williams, Kenneth Murray, Kyra Elam. None of these players are been very good. So I guess I get the value, but I just feel like there were other players available at those values. I did like this one flew under the radar and I didn't notice it until I looked at the depth chart. The Jack Sanborn signing is a little bit intriguing to me as a
Yeah.
linebacker. But yeah, you spelled out all the needs. It's kind of the same needs that there were before free agency, and they got players, but they still need to get better at all of those positions, and they need to get better through the draft. They have been a very good drafting team, though. I think so much also depends on their own offensive line development because
Yeah.
if they can count on those guys to continue improving, and I think I'm actually okay with that plan because I think all of the guys that they've drafted have shown enough for you to feel like, okay, let's see what we got next year in Guyton, and obviously Smith is a star, and the interior BB and Hoffman. It's fine. But you need that because they're not, I don't think they can address, they have so many other positions to address in the draft.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry.
They're interesting because like Tyler Guyton is this big pivot point. Like if Guyton
Yeah.
doesn't work out, suddenly the line is a problem. If Tyler Guyton works out, it's all good. We don't even need to worry about the line.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Which is great. Then you can go get Matthew Golden or Ted or
Right.
whatever, and and then it's you're on fire. All right, let's take a quick break and come back and talk about the Tennessee Titans. All right, we're back. Uh, I tweeted this. I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. If the Titans aren't taking Cam Ward with pick 1 now, they have done an all-time sales job of convincing the world that they are. And I did that in reference to them, like, sending 1,000,000 people to watch his pro day and taking him out to dinner and all of this, which are all the things you should do regardless, because even if you're not taking him, you want people to trade up for him. But also because of the way they approached free agency, right? Which is not taking quarterback and investing in the offensive line. Um, that said, they still have pretty glaring needs at expensive positions, starting with, of course, quarterback. And then receiver, edge now is a big need for them. Those are the top 3 needs I wrote down, and they're all pretty expensive needs.
Yeah, I mean, quarterback's the obvious thing, right? I've been just assuming they're drafting Cam Ward at this stage. I've kind of been assuming that the whole way along, even though they sent everybody for like a 2-week period. They sent everybody to mock drafting Abdul Carter and everybody else in number 1 overall because of that comment about, we're not going to pass on a blue chip player. But I think they've been quarterback the whole way. They need wide receivers 1 and 3. I think Ridley's good as a 2. I think they need 1 and 3 either side of him.
Yeah, it's tough because edge is also such a glaring, like, they're funny because they could use Ward, Hunter, or Carter, and it
Yeah.
would be, and so the reason why it kind of made sense for them to trade down is like, well, if you could trade down to 3 and still get the blue chipper and get draft capital, you set yourself up for your quarterback next year. But I don't think this organization is playing for next year at this point, or the coach and the GM and whatnot. So Okay, this one should be easy. The Houston Texans.
I don't know that they're that easy. I think both
Really?
trenches. Yeah, I mean, I think it's more that I think they have a few needs, but they're kind of it's not just one thing. Like I think the
Mm.
defensive interior needs some help. Obviously, the edge rushers are insane, but like I'm not in love with Sheldon Rankins and Tim Settle as a defensive tackle duo. I would absolutely want to add a body in there, particularly in this draft. Like there's a lot of these three technique pass rushing defensive tackles that would be a great fit there. I think the offensive line is probably still a need, but I think they've actually done a reasonable job of patching that back up.
Ooh, I don't know, dude. I do not like the players that they brought in on that offensive line.
So it's kind of like it's a little bit like Dallas in how you view their young players. Like, because so
Yeah.
much of it is, contingent on Juice Scruggs and Jared Patterson. I don't think the line should have ever been as bad as it was a year ago. Like, I don't think that was necessarily a personnel problem. It was everything else. So, and look, Cam Robinson is not a great left tackle, but he's fine, right? He's perfectly serviceable as a left tackle. Um, so it's definitely not like I don't think it's gonna cute disaster area the way it was last season, but that's not to say you don't upgrade it, like, definitely add some bodies.
Yeah, I would really try to upgrade. I hear you on the young players, and I hear you also, I've talked about this a lot, on the scheme and the quarterback and all of it, making it all look where it was just a total cluster.
Yeah,
I just don't think much of these players, either the ones on the roster or the ones that they've brought in. So I would love for them, doesn't matter, every position. I guess center, they're probably fine, but guard, tackle, I would go crazy. I'd like to keep Tyus Howard at guard, frankly. He was
yeah,
better as a guard. So
same.
receiver is kind of you're right about defensive tackle. Receiver and tight end are kind of interesting to me as a combo thing, just because I really like the Christian Kirk signing. Obviously, Nico Collins is a star, but you don't know Tank Dell's status.
Yeah.
Feel like you bring in the tight ends guy, Nick Caley. Maybe you want to run more 12. They could be a fun if they find a tight end. It's a very good tight end draft. That might be fun to bring in. Like imagine Collins, Christian Kirk, Dalton Schultz, and like a young tight end. Like that idea. So
Yeah.
okay. I will go next with the Indianapolis Colts. All right. I wrote tight end. They might be the biggest tight end. I'm sure everybody is mocking them tight ends, right? Like
Yeah.
every yeah. I wrote tight end. I wrote interior offensive line, which is suddenly a need for them with the players walking out the door. And then I wrote edge question. You lose Odiingbo. See if you can get more out of Latu this year. That's not a primary need, but I would put it as a secondary one. They really threw a lot of resources at their secondary, which is really interesting because it's not something that they have historically done, bringing in Cam Bynum and Trevorius Ward. And then I wrote as a secondary need quarterback, but I don't think that. I think bringing Daniel Jones as competition will probably suffice.
Yeah, they might need a quarterback, but it's a future problem. Like, they're gonna
Yeah.
let that competition of Daniel Jones, Richardson play out, and that will effectively determine how bad the need is a quarterback. If Daniel Jones wins, it's an immediate acute need. If Richardson wins, maybe that can still work long term. The secondary thing is interesting because I think what you saw was, I mean, they went away from one of the most extreme schemes in the league in terms of like this is the type of player we get, right? The old
Yeah.
school Seattle cover three system. And they'd been drafting those bodies for years. So I think part of the turnover is like most of these guys don't apply to the new system. We need to just start changing some personnel here. I think the Colts, like by far the biggest need is tight end. And one of the chalkiest like player plus team fits in mock drafts has got to be Tyler Warren or Colson Loveland to the Colts. Either one of them makes ton of sense, fits first round, like lock it in if it's available. But outside of that, though, like they were another one of these teams where I'm like, like sneakily, this is a pretty
Not
good
bad.
roster. Like
Yeah,
there's
I agree.
definitely some areas, I would tinker around with and try and upgrade here or there. But like I'm not once I get tight end sorted, I'm not screaming out for these other spots I desperately need to upgrade.
Totally agree with the Colts, which was it was interesting to look at the roster and feel that way. All right, what do you have for the Jaguars?
Jags, I think cornerback is a big need for them. I think defensive tackle is a pretty significant need for them. I think that's why another one of the chalkiest picks has got to be Mason Graham, the Michigan defensive tackle to the Jags
Yeah.
at 5. makes a ton of sense. Like that, I'm lock it in.
Is there any okay, so I agree, and I think it makes perfect sense. They desperately need interior pass rush between their edges. If they weren't to go Mason Graham, is there any other player you think that makes sense for them there?
I mean, again, like Travis Hunter makes sense. Now I'm talking about
Well,
cornerback Travis Hunter.
agree.
So
Yeah, if he's yeah,
yeah.
that would be amazing, yeah.
After that, like I've found this a few times. I've been so locked in on Mason Graham to the Jags that anytime I find anytime I'm doing a mock and I that is off the table, I'm like, man, I don't know where they go here.
Yeah. The trade down, I guess, would be
Yeah,
the other if you can get a corner, maybe a guard, just, defensive tackle later. Because the corners are interesting, right? Because they're not likely to go that high. But then
yeah,
when you get down past 10, it's like, okay, now we're looking at Will Johnson, we're looking at Jahdae Barron. But yeah, it does feel like Mason Graham is like already a Jaguar. The Falcons, shocker, edge. Yet again, it is edge. I wrote also center, corner, receiver, but edge.
yeah. And,
Edge.
and honestly, I mean, not necessarily even definitely edge, but I don't know if defensive tackle is not as acute a need as well. They
Yeah,
just have some bodies there that they drafted a year ago. But like, because of what they did with Michael Penix, like everyone was expecting them to come away with Dallas Turner or
mhm,
Latu, whoever their favorite edge was at that spot. So the second they picked the quarterback, like every other pick basically went on the defensive line to try and make up for the fact that they didn't draft one with the top 10 draft pick. None of them showed anything right away. Now injuries were a big part of that, but do they have faith that Ororo or Dorless or any of those guys is going to do anything year two? Because if they don't, like defensive tackles a need
mhm.
as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's funny but think where they're picking aligns with edge more
Yeah,
than
yeah,
defensive tackle, right? Because especially if Graham's there, it's like obviously, But it's just been and they didn't, again, free agency, you bring in Morgan Fox and Leonard Floyd. All right, it's we know what the score is with Atlanta, and it has been the same score now for many years. Actually, now that I'm looking at it, I have edge for every NFC South team. Hmm. All right. Well, what do you have for the Bucks?
I have edge for the Bucks. Reddick is a 1 year deal, and who knows what version of Reddick you're going to get at this point, given how last year went. At some point, I think they need to have a plan for when Levante David isn't still there, even though that seems to be endless and he's not. He's still really good. And then maybe a left guard, but I wouldn't. It's not like a desperation need. Again, this is a pretty clean roster.
Good team, good offense. I was just like, damn, this offense is. It turns out when you draft and develop in your offensive line,
Yeah,
you're pretty much in good shape there. And this is now the defense is obviously like I had all, edge. I wrote corner too. I could see them maybe taking a corner. But for the most part, it really is about the defense with them. It's funny though. Okay, so Saints, edge. I also wrote corner, which is I think a direction they could. This is where you start because they're picking what 10, right? Nine or 10. 9, because the Bears are 10.
9, I think they
Yeah,
pick.
so this is where you start you're, like, looking at the edges, like your Jalen Walkers, your Michael Williams, but then Will Johnson, Barrett I think this is where it starts to become a little bit more of a conversation between edge and corner. Um, guard, and then secondary need, I wrote quarterback, receiver, offensive tackle. So, I think they go most likely defense in the top of the draft. This defense just needs to get younger and faster, and it's been the case for a minute now.
Yeah, I think again, it's another one where I think the defensive tackle is maybe a bigger need than the edge. Like I actually kind of I like the starting duo of Chase Young and Carl Granderson. Chase Young feels weird to me because I think he's conditioned by like what we all think he should be, like what we expected him to be at draft time in the Nick Bosa world of like generational all-time prospect type of guy. Injuries derail that. And now that he's just sort of settled in as solid, it feels like a letdown, but actually, like he's solid. He's a solid starting caliber edge rusher.
No, it's a good point. They did sign him to a 3-year deal, so
Yeah.
I guess they don't view edge as a glaring need. Defensive tackles a good point. I should have mentioned that as well. Yeah, it's mm. It'll be yeah, this is an interesting one for them. I feel like one thing I would emphasize is premium positions because they need to save money. So if they can find, players, defensive line, corner, receiver, cheap, that is much needed. What do you have for the Panthers? I had a lot.
Yeah, I mean, they still need a number 1 wide receiver. I don't know if they have faith that Leggett can be that guy or Leggett. How is there? Do we have an official? What's the book on his name pronunciation? Is it Leggett?
I've been saying it Leggett. Is that
That's how I
wrong?
started saying it, and then there was like it was like we started to shift towards Leggett as the year wore
Yes.
on. I lost
Yes.
confidence.
I
Anyway,
do
they
like
need a wide
him.
receiver 1.
Like, I am a
Um, And then I think they still need impact defensive linemen. Like I think their plan B, once they didn't get Milton Williams in free agency, was pretty solid. Like they added some good bodies, but they need that like impact player, whether it's the edge or the defensive tackle. Like find one of them at number 8. I don't care which one. And then I think there's another team that could use linebacker help as well.
Yep, same with me, wide receiver, and then all 3 levels of the defense. Again, I think they'll prioritize edge. I swear to God, I'll stop saying the word edge as we move on we get out of the NFC South. Uh, but just because of where they're picking and the
Yeah.
options, it's a little bit tricky again when you get out of. They're a team that if there's a trade up Carter scenario, I would actually keep my eye on them, and they should seriously consider it because they need it's funny. You don't pay Brian Burns. Okay, now you need an edge one, and it is a problem of their own making in some ways. But I do think at all 3 players they could use impact play. They need a corner opposite J.C. Horn. They need a linebacker. But yeah, wide receiver 1, 2 remains the need on offense. The offensive line though in decent shape, which is
Yeah.
nice for them. Okay, we will wrap with both North divisions. Let's start with the AFC North, and I will go with a team that doesn't need edge to mix things up. The Pittsburgh Steelers.
Definitely don't need edge.
Quarterback? Regardless of what happens with Aaron Rodgers, they need a quarterback.
Yeah.
Corner, running back, I wrote down. Secondary needs, defensive tackle, and then I wrote offensive line depth. You could go to any position, really. Tackle, probably there, given some of the injury history of their tackles. And linebacker, I wrote, again, depth. But the main needs, I wrote quarterback, corner, running back, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I had quarterback, I had running back as one. I don't love Warren as an every down, I
No.
think they need a committee. And that's not a knock on Warren. Like most people use a committee at this point. There are very few bell cow running backs anymore. And I don't think he's one of them. So I think they need to add, the Najee Harris replacement. But yeah, the one not even difference, but I had it higher. I was like, they probably need a left tackle. Like I already I'm about ready to write off Broderick Jones.
Mm.
So I think they need a starting left tackle, and maybe whichever way round they want those 2 tackles, right? Fautanu, right side, Broderick Jones,
Yeah.
left side. Jones right now looks like he needs to be replaced.
Yeah. That experiment. Not really seeing the improvement that you'd like to see there. Receiver is also an interesting one to watch with them because uh, it depends on their own internal sense of how long George Pickens is going to be a Pittsburgh Steeler, and if that you're right, like if they are eyeing potential trade, then that would be a position I think that they
Yeah.
might target as well. Okay, give me the Browns.
So I think for the Browns, quarterback is the biggest need. They don't have one. Like they have the contract of one.
How dare you? Kenny Pickett exists.
No, Kenny Pickett changed nothing about my outlook for the Browns at
First
all.
round pick,
Um,
traded for
they
better.
have they have this unique crippling situation of they're paying a quarterback like one of the top players in the league, and he functionally doesn't exist for them right now. Whether or not, I mean, leaving aside from the fact that he retore his Achilles and is probably not going to play probably not going to suit up at all this season because of that. Even if he was, he's been playing so badly that they can't have him on the field anyway. So
Yeah.
they need a quarterback.
First of all, I like how they're not even pretending that Deshaun Watson is an option for them anymore. Like, we
Right.
talked about this in the last pod. They posted Myles Garrett being like, "I have a pretty good idea of who." They're like, "Myles Garrett, is bought in on our quarterback plan." It's like, damn, you guys aren't even acting like you said functionally doesn't exist is exactly how they're acting.
Right.
I will say doing this exercise made me a little bit nervous about the rookie quarterback if assuming they go that route or if they trade for Kirk Cousins or whatever because I was looking at their offense and I think I've thought of them as being in better shape than they are at the
Yeah.
moment. Um the offensive line in particular, which has been just a strength for several years, even when they've lost guys, they've been able to find good depth, guys like DeJuan Jones, for example, who's but offensive line now, I do feel like is something that they have to address and continue improving. Receiver as well, running back as well. So draft a quarterback with that second overall pick. Yeah, really have to make some improvements elsewhere, don't you think?
Well, it all feels a little bit just creaky now, right? Like
Yeah.
it would be if you had like a top 5 quarterback, it would be fine. You would be looking at this roster and you're like, yeah, there's some areas where they could upgrade or there's some potential weaknesses, but it doesn't really matter because they've got the quarterback. But because the quarterback was a disaster, now you're looking at this and saying, man, this whole thing could fall apart fast. I saw that's kind of where they are to me. Like it's the reality of a roster when you're dealing with a contract like that. And normally that's like a fair enough trade-off because you have the quarterback who can offset that. But when that doesn't work, now you don't have the quarterback and you're dealing with the sort of consequences of the sacrifices that contract brings.
The Cincinnati Bengals do not need a quarterback. They also don't need a receiver.
No.
But what do they need?
I think they still need offensive line, interior in particular.
Yeah,
I think they
guard.
again, like they did a pretty good job of just getting it to an average level. And then last year, all of the average players played below their standard. So suddenly the line is a problem. I think that's an area. And then defense, though, possibly not as acute as it looked last year. Like I think again, a little bit
You
like
think?
the Houston offensive line. I think the
Yeah.
defense looked a lot better this year
You're
just by
giving
changing scheme.
me you're giving me the same reaction that I had to the Houston offensive line where I'm like,
Yeah.
"Really?" My voice goes up like 10 octaves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ooh, I don't
It's
know
like
about that one, chief. This is a
like,
pretty
stay
bad
with me here.
defense.
It wasn't as bad as it looked last
Tell me
year.
on it, because I'm looking at the depth chart and it is,
But I think immediately it's gonna look better just by changing the scheme. I think also the young guys in the secondary, the corners, I think we're starting to turn a corner, uh, pun non intended. Those young guys, Dax Hill, et cetera, I think those guys are actually moving in the right direction. They definitely need defensive line, like an influx of players there, regardless of the Trey Hendrickson thing. Hopefully he's still there. If he's not, obviously that becomes immediately their biggest weakness and biggest need. But like they need someone else that can rush the passer. They need somebody else that can make an impact there. But I honestly think this defense will look a lot better quickly.
I hope you're right. I wrote defense guard. I think for defense, when it comes down to prioritizing, I did write front seven over secondary. Both I do view as problems, but I think at least with the secondary, you've seen, I wouldn't say they've turned a corner, but you've seen flashes of interesting play from some of these young guys, Cam Taylor-Britt, your Dax Hill, your Jordan Battle, whatever, Geno Stone, maybe you can get a comeback season from. Whereas with the defensive line, I haven't even seen flashes, man, from these guys. Like you got to really
Yeah.
focus on, and you got to get a lot younger and better at linebacker too. That would be another. The linebacker play was just unsustainably bad last year. I mean, those guys were just playing like they had rocks in their shoes. So, yeah, I think front seven is what I would prioritize in addition to guard. That's the other need. All right, the Ravens. I'll do this one, wrapping it up. Interesting team. Not a lot in free agency, but they did bring back Ronnie Stanley, which I think every probably person who does an NFL podcast loved. Ricard. They bring in DeAndre Hopkins. It's interesting. Didn't cost very
Yeah.
much. Cooper Rush is maybe the world's most hilarious backup situation now. I just love that pairing of him and Lamar Jackson. So I wrote guard. Patrick McCarry, who was starting guard for them, is gone. Where did he sign? Somewhere. I liked it. I was like, ooh, that's good. I can't remember.
Where did he sign?
You can look it up while I'm.
Yeah.
So I wrote guard. I wrote corner, and then I wrote edge, which they have edges. They always have edges. They always have old guys who they sign at the last minute. But, I think Ojabo, I would still continue throwing resources at it. But guard and corner. Corner is, Brandon Stevens is gone. I'm sure it's the delight of Ravens fans, but they do need someone, and
Yeah.
I like corner. One thing I think is an interesting decision for them is corner versus safety because it's an interesting puzzle or kind of in Kyle Hamilton who plays every position, Marlon Humphrey who could play outside inside. I think what you want, hear me out on this, if you're the Ravens is just the ability to put them in the best positions in every game. And so the more competent corners and safeties you have, the more positional flexibility you get from a matchup perspective. So I like the idea of them continuing to throw resources at secondary, but not with any we have to get a guy to play outside or we have to get a guy to play safety. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it gives you because those guys have positional flexibility, I think it gives you just so much flexibility, so much ability to just take players that you really like, even if you were locked into this guy's got to play outside, well, now you're dismissing everyone that plays in the slot, from your range of outcomes. Now you can be like, we love this slot guy. Marlon Humphrey can play
Yeah.
outside. Like, let's make that work. So I think, yeah, cornerback two is definitely an area that I would go, but I would like you. I don't think it necessarily matters whether cornerback two for them is a slot guy or
Yeah.
plays outside, because Humphrey's there and because Kyle Hamilton's there. Patrick McCarry signed with the Jags, by the way.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I remember being like, oh, okay. He's a guy's just good and useful.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you take a safety too, again, obviously it's probably not gonna be your first round draft pick, but then it's like, okay, maybe some games because I do love Kyle Hamilton close to the line of scrimmage, and you want that optionality. So the more guys you can put in the back, the better. Obviously, a very good roster. All right. The NFC North. A lot of very good rosters was my takeaway going through
Yeah.
this whole division. I was like, damn, not a lot of needs in the NFC North. Which might be why Dan Campbell wants to make sure they all get into the top of the playoffs, right? Because these are all really good football teams. Y- Let's not start with the Lions. You go first with the Bears, who are very active in free agency, or actually
They
not ahead of free
were.
agency too.
Yeah, so they repaired most of the problem
Yeah,
spots that I would have had for them going into it. Now I think cornerback two, like Tyreek Stevenson, I didn't love as a draft pick at the time. I feel like that's reaching the end of its experiment after last season. Linebacker, maybe are they going to move on from either
really.
one or both of the guys they signed a couple of years ago, TJ Edwards and Tremaine Edmonds? And then maybe they want to turbocharge the running back position, but that's it. I'm not scared of anything else on that roster, really.
Do you feel good about Braxton Jones at left tackle?
So it's like good.
Yeah,
I don't feel good about it, but I feel fine about it. I think he's a solid player. And I think there's an underrated degree of value to a solid offensive lineman, but fans hate it. Fans
I
hate
know.
solid because
It,
solid, when it runs up against elite, gets its ass
uh,
kicked. That's the problem with solid.
but what if Solid has the help of getting to play next to Joe Tooney, and then suddenly Solid becomes above average, and maybe that's a
Yeah.
draft pick you could spend on Ashton Genty instead if he's there
Right.
or what? Yeah, it's an interesting. I was surprised by. Okay, I'm going to sound like a broken record. All of these teams I thought were in good shape, but the Bears were one where I was like, oh, a lot of these needs, edge, interior offensive line, they did address, and I think corner is an interesting one. I might still throw at edge, to be honest.
Yeah.
Defensive line generally, even though they added Ode Ingbo. Um, I wrote also safety, depending on what's going on with Jaquan Brisker, who
Right.
obviously had the concussions. So, because that was his absence was really felt last year, I
Yeah.
thought. Okay, I will do the Lions again. Stacked, man. I know we know that it's obvious. This is a really good football team, but just taking a look at this roster, I was once again reminded of how good the team is and how few needs that they have. You did lose Kevin Zeitler. They signed DJ Reed, addressing what was probably their biggest need, which
Yeah.
was
Love that.
corner. Edge is the only thing that is glaring to me. someone to play opposite Aiden Hutchinson. That was obviously a huge need when Hutchinson went down and, well, they lost everybody. And then I wrote guard,
Yeah.
with Zeiler guy. And this is a team that understands the importance and value of the offensive line. I think they're just going to continue. But even like bring guy like Tim Patrick back, I was like, oh,
Love it.
okay, like, yeah, love it. And I don't really think they need a receiver. So guard and edge.
Yeah, basically the same. I think edge is the biggest need that they have, and one that I would want to see them address that. The rest of them, like if they didn't address them, I don't think I'd be that sad. I think I would love to see at least one more just contingency option at cornerback, but DJ Reed went such a long way towards, mitigating any concerns you would have there. Now it's like if either one of Terry and Arnold or and Ennis Rakestraw from last year work out, you're set. Amik Robinson coming back as well gives you some flexibility there. And then guard is that other spot. Like Mahogany, really liked him as a prospect, but he's an unknown quantity now at right guard. And then Graham Glasgow, I think, is the weak link on that offensive line now anyway. So
Yeah.
if you drafted a guard and we're like, well, if Mahogany doesn't, isn't good right away, he can challenge to start. And then even if Mahogany's good, we can potentially look to push Graham Glasgow out of the lineup going forward. I think guard would make some sense.
And it's, they're Jared Goff is the future of this franchise. Like, they're tied to him for a long time. You
Yeah.
have to keep investing in the most important thing for Jared Goff, which is pass protection. And they know that. They clearly, this is a
Yeah.
team that has earned our trust when it comes to roster construction. Okay, speaking of teams that I guess have invested in their offensive lines, the Minnesota Vikings also threw quite a bit of resources at the offensive line. So that took away what I thought was the biggest need for them, interior offensive line. What do you have as maybe that's still a need in your estimation? What do you have as their remaining needs, though?
Yeah, I mean, they took away most of the needs. I think the interior was their biggest need. I think they were acutely aware of that. It felt like, when Kansas City lost to Tampa Bay in the Super Bowl, and it's like
Yeah,
everything about them became the
right.
offensive line. Like no matter what we do, that is never happening again. And to be fair, like that was their backup offensive line. That wasn't even like the
Yeah.
starting unit that got wrecked. But
My favorite
Minnesota
guy, Cam
came out.
Robinson.
Yeah,
Sorry.
but Minnesota came out of those games, the Lions game and then the Rams game, and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, this offensive line that we thought was actually in reasonable shape turns out it really needs work if we want to win games like this. And they did. Like they threw a lot at it. Now there's some question marks, but I think they've solidified those spots. Left guard, I think they could still upgrade. Blake Brendel, I think, is scheduled to start for them right now. You could upgrade on Blake Brendel if the right guy is available. Cornerback, I would still like to see them address. Byron Murphy, they brought back in the slot. Mekhi Blackman is coming back off an ACL. I think he's probably their best corner. Isaiah Rodgers is a nice depth piece, but I'm not in love with him starting. So if they can find another starting corner, I would definitely like that for them. That's kind of it. Those two spots.
Yeah, I have corner as by far the biggest need, and then after that, it's really depth.
Yeah.
Potentially, they need another quarterback. We'll see what goes down there. Um, Running back, they brought back Aaron Jones and they traded for Jordan Mason. It's
Yeah.
nothing. I would still like them to later round take a running back, and then I wrote defensive tackle depth because they did bring in Jonathan Allen and Javon Hargrave, but those are two older players, so I think that's a position that they could get younger at, but corner is the biggest need. It's a team that is in very good shape. Corner is also needed for the Green Bay Packers. We will end here. Great team, really good players, but needs at very expensive positions. And I think that's a frustrating place to be in as a franchise. Corner now and wide receiver and edge. I just wrote you need a difference making wide receiver and you need a difference making pass rusher.
Yeah.
Otherwise, your team's great. But that's so frustrating because it's like such a well-built team and those are such expensive positions, Sam.
Yeah, it's more so cornerback, I think, is its own thing. Like cornerback particularly with Jair Alexander being like maybe on the trading block and maybe on his way out. I mean, if Alexander's off this roster, suddenly corner is like a glaring, fire
Yeah.
alarm type of weakness for them that they desperately need help with. Even outside of that, I look at their corners. It's like the cornerback room, the cornerback version of Buffalo's wide receiver group, right? Where like
Yeah.
everybody works better in the slot. Nate Hobbs, I love in the slot. Keyshawn Nixon, I like in the slot. Bullard, I think, is best in the slot. Like they've got this collection of guys that all work inside. And somebody's got to play outside, and I think it'll be Hobbs, which I don't love that. But so cornerback, I think, is a thing. But then outside of that, it's like you're right. They just need a difference maker in these spots. Like edges, then the defensive line, it's okay, but they could really use like one impact player. And then wide receiver, same thing. Like it's a useful group, but they're missing that like one guy who can just crush it. That's why Josh Jacobs was out campaigning
Like,
for it. Problem is
yeah.
those guys, they're A, expensive, B, hard to come by, and C, they don't just, grow on trees. You can't just guarantee that the draft pick fixes it.
The way I would put it with the Packers is like the roster's in great shape. I still believe in the quarterback. Coach is fantastic. I think that both coaches proven, I thought, Halfley really earned his stripes last year, but they need a closer on both sides of the ball. They need an edge rusher who can just get at the quarterback, in the end of the playoff game, and they need a receiver who can get you a bucket versus man coverage. Yeah. And it's like they're so close. And if you could just drop those two things in, this would be a Super Bowl caliber roster. But those are two very hard things to find, especially when you're a team that never picks in the top half of the draft because you're really good. They're going to be picking obviously at the end of the first round. So
100%. Like it's such a difficult spot to be in where like the positions you're missing are two of the top 4 positions that somebody's going to go after to like start a team from scratch.
Brian Gutekunst, just get crazy. Just trade up for Abdul Carter. I don't know. They'll never do that, obviously. It's like, imagine like if they had like a Will Johnson, which they wouldn't have to go up to the top for. That would be cool too.
Yeah.
They won't do that. All right. Thus concludes. We went through all 32 teams in pretty quick time, I'd say. How would you say my time management, my clock management compares to Steve?
Oh, this is like record-setting pace for us. Like evidently the problem is not either one of us on our own. It's when we get together that it's a disaster.
Well, even with that less than glowing endorsement, please go check out the Check the Mic podcast, available wherever you get your pods. You guys are also on YouTube, as am I, youtube.com/@Mina Kimes. I am starting to put some more draft content there, including I did a first dog walk mock where I mocked the first 10 picks while walking Lenny yesterday.
Nice.
Which was an interesting challenge of concentration. It's only on YouTube. Thank you, as always, to the folks who produce this show at Omaha Productions, Kirsten Sebecki, Anthony Jimenez, Owen Saylor, Jack Foster, Tucker Tashjian. I will be back next week. Finally, I keep being like, I'm going to talk about these draft picks. Next week, I'm going to talk about the draft picks. We are talking quarterbacks. Tyler shook heads. It's your moment.
Wow!